I do think it would be hilarious if Kratos had a 1% chance to start reciting the Iliad after activating Rage, considering he alludes to Mimir that it is his favorite poem. But alas, he is decidedly not a calm and reasonable person. Welcome to Raeb's Tavern in the city of Nidavellir in the realm of Svartalfheim. Fun fact, Raeb the Bard and owner of this establishment is voiced by Bear McCreary. Raeb is Bear spelled backwards, and he is the composer for the new God of War games, as well as partnering with Howard Shore to make the Lord of the Rings of Power soundtrack, Battlestar Galactica, Percy Jackson, Godzilla, King of the Monsters, and many more franchises. Durlin, the revolutionary dwarf, and Dinner, his pet baby kraken, also come around from time to time. The tavern's clear today, though, because we need to talk about the most quintessential drink from Kratos' adventures in the 9 realms of Norse mythology, known as Blood Mead. I'll provide an overview of its in-game lore and the real-life concepts that inspired it, explore a cookbook set in the universe, consider some commercial meads that could potentially correspond to it, and ultimately set out to brew a mead that I consider the most accurate rendition of this franchise's particular depiction of the Blood Mead. There will be relevant chapters below, but I highly recommend watching the video through in its entirety and using the chapters on a rewatch if you want any particular information reiterated in the future. Also, since this is my first video in the God of War franchise, I expect we may have a few new faces in the audience. If that's you, hello and welcome. My name is Nick, and I make videos about drinks and franchises I hyperfixate on the lore of. The Elder Scrolls is really where we got started and my personal favorite topics to focus on, but other franchises I've been making beverage videos about are most recently The Lord of the Rings, A Song of Ice and Fire, and Fallout. There will be more videos in these worlds as well as some additional ones in the God of War franchise coming out before the end of the year, with the Secret Level show coming out on Amazon in December, so please consider subscribing and checking out some of my other videos if that interests you. Anyways, back to the lore of Blood Mead. First, let's talk about Rage. In both Norse games in the franchise, the beverage serves to increase Kratos' maximum rage meter, which has various implications depending on his chosen weapon. I'm personally partial to just bare knuckles or the classic Blades of Chaos. In Ragnarok, certain story missions require that you play as Atreus, Kratos' son, also known by his prophetic Jotnar name of Loki. His giant blood means that rage expresses differently in him than in Kratos. Rather than just getting beefed up stats for a moment, Atreus shifts his physical form when enraged. We only see the form of a bear and a wolf in the game, but he would likely be capable of embodying any creature with the proper discipline and self-control. The bear form in-game manifests without his awareness, representing his subconscious loneliness as he pursues his quest for answers about Loki without Kratos' initial approval, albeit with the dwarf Sindri's assistance, and resulting with a tragic encounter with his father early in the game.
Atreus! 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 Atreus!
When the player gains the ability to actively use rage as Atreus, you shift into the form of a wolf instead, representing his feeling of togetherness with both his father and, more importantly, the few remnants of the giants of Jotunheim left in the world, and the implied promise of finding more if he sets out to do so. Bears are mostly solitary creatures that leave their families when they're of age, handling encounters with brute force, while wolves are pack animals, relying on strength in numbers and agility to take down their prey. The song featuring Heggir that appears at the end of the game, Blood Upon the Snow, references these motifs with the lines, "The bear that keeps to his own line, the wolf that seeks always its own kind." I love this song and its symbolism, so we're going to dissect its intro just a bit as it pertains to the dynamic between the rage of these two characters before moving on. The bear that keeps to his own line is referencing Kratos' inherent loneliness as a god who has grown accustomed to loss in life on his own, having been tricked into murdering his original family, subsequently destroying the gods of his original pantheon, and losing his newfound family in Fae, or her secret Jotnar name, Laufey the Just. He does his best to raise their young son on his own, but he does not have the experience or tools to know how to best parent the boy outside of what he knows, which is largely combat-oriented. Kratos harnesses rage in moments where it's generally useful to protect himself and those in his immediate circle, although sometimes goes a little bit above and beyond. He is gruff and a man of few words. He knows he needs to figure out how to help Atreus process the burdens of growing into a god too, but the same burden was thrust on Kratos, and he hasn't unpacked the corresponding emotions for himself to even begin to guide his son to do the same. He doesn't even initially know this emotional baggage is with him. His experiences have taught him to suppress them as a defense mechanism, which works for a time, but without dealing with it later, he accumulates unresolved traumas with severe implications. Atreus simply learns from his father by observation, but without the context of the moral lessons Kratos has subconsciously retained in his many years as a soldier and a god. So the boy releases his rage in outbursts at any perceived grievance, incapable of knowing when to do so and when to hold back without the proper guidance. The wolf that seeks always its own kind is then referring to Atreus, who has learned of his godhood and prophetic identity as Loki, a harbinger of Ragnarok, his giant heritage, and that it turns out he actually isn't the last of the Jotnar after all. His father's unwillingness to pursue answers to the prophecies surrounding his son leads Atreus to set out on his own, not unlike a young bear, but he craves the unity of a pack, which he begins to find in Angerboda, as well as developing a moral compass of his own. Again, this all corresponds to the way he channels the in-game rage ability, first as a bear, but then as a wolf as he finds peace in community. The next line in the intro is, "The world that hardens is a harsher winter hold," representing the descent of the Nine Realms into Fimbulwinter at the end of the last game, which impacts each of the realms in unique ways, but in all of them makes life more extreme and difficult. And Kratos and Atreus inadvertently caused this cataclysm at the end of the 2018 game by killing Baldur to prevent him from killing his own mother, Freya. They go on to survive years of Midgard freezing over and being relentlessly pursued by her, seeking vengeance for the death of her child, despite the fact that if they hadn't done so, she wouldn't be around to begin with. The worlds and hearts within it are all hardening in the harsh reality of Fimbulwinter. The final line we'll consider is, "The parent forced to eat its young before it grows." There are many meanings that could be implied from this line in particular, but I'll do my best to interpret it in a light surrounding today's focus. First, male bears are rather infamous in the animal kingdom for eating cubs, which is why they don't really stick around as a part of the family unit in nature. Our proverbial bear, Kratos, is initially extremely wary of pursuing the aforementioned prophecy with his son. I think his quote,
"Fate only binds you if you let it. Do what is necessary, not because it is written,"
sums this up nicely. He is rather furious as Atreus pursues this path without his approval, but Mimir counsels him to listen to the boy, give him time and space, and trust him implicitly rather than immediately responding in anger. It's safe to say that Kratos fears the possibility of his son growing into a god like the ones he struck down in Greece, and wrestles with the fear of one day having to cut him down like that entire pantheon, or like they did with Baldur before Atreus reaches a similarly irredeemable point in his trajectory. Now that we've considered the rage of Kratos and Atreus that the Blood Mead strengthens and dissected a really good song about it, let's consider the origins of Blood Mead using both in-game lore and the real-world stories that inspired it. There is a certain important character referenced with Easter eggs that you collect throughout the game, but who does not actually appear. However, he may just be who the Blood Mead is actually derived from. Now, I did not brush up on my ancient Norse pronunciations, so if I butcher any of this, I do apologize. But in our world, the Skaldskaparmal is the second part of the Prose Edda, a compilation of Norse mythology assembled by Snorri Sturluson of Iceland in the 13th century and where this original myth is told. In short, there was a divine fellow by the name of Kvasir. As a being born of the saliva of the Aesir and the Vanir, he was extremely wise, spending his time traveling and teaching different peoples until he was killed by the cruel dwarf brothers Fjalar and Galar, who then mixed his blood with honey and thereby crafted the Mead of Poetry, said to cause the drinker to become a skald or scholar and giving them the ability to recite any information or solve any question. The dwarves told the gods that Kvasir had suffocated in intelligence, and held on to the ill-begotten mead until the giant Suttungr sought vengeance on the dwarfs for also killing his parents. In lieu of drowning them, the giant accepted the Mead of Poetry, which he had his daughter guard until a disguised Odin seduced her and stole all of the mead to give to the gods and those gifted in poetry. Beyond being a metaphor for poetic inspiration, the mead is also often associated with Odin's possession, or berserker rage. Clearly, we have our mythical rage-inducing mead quite literally made from blood here. In God of War Ragnarok, like the other Norse figures, Kvasir's tale has some creative twists applied to it. First, when you find Kvasir's family Crest on Vanaheim with Freya, she'll recount her relatively unfavorable view of the famed poet.
The family crest of Kvasir the Wise. More like Kvasir the Inebriated, in truth.
Mimir's notes on the artifact expand on this, saying, Kvasir, the legendary lush. The stories call him wise beyond words. The inventor of poetry, they say. When he died, his friends mixed his blood with honey to create the Mead of Poetry, said to imbue any who imbibed it with the power of lyrical wisdom. All bollocks, of course. Kvasir was great for one thing and one thing only, throwing back drinks. Not to disparage him in the slightest. Most of us can only hope to be as good at anything as Kvasir was holding his alcohol. But his poetry often took the form of progressively more imaginative forms of profanity, and those who drank his blood only felt inspired because the salt's fluids were at least 50% booze by the time he finally keeled over. Really funny bloke though. Knew his way around a double entendre. Throughout Ragnarok, you can also find a total of 14 poems written by Kvasir that are all a bit of a fourth wall break as references to other Sony game properties like The Last of Us, Ratchet & Clank, and Bloodborne, to name a few. After collecting a couple, Kratos questions Mimir as to the writer's fate.
What became of Kvasir?
Ripped apart by his audience. Well, one member of his audience. Well, Thor.
I'm not sure if the dialogue options are location locked or simply occur in the order that you find them, but if the line is meant to be delivered in this realm, it happens here in Svartalfheim, which could be a nod to the dwarf brothers Fjalar and Galar, potentially being the unnamed friends present at Kvasir's last poetry slam, considering this realm is the home of the dwarves. Either way, from these breadcrumbs, we can piece together that in the God of War universe, Kvasir was murdered by Thor for some presumably blasphemous satire about the god of thunder or perhaps even Odin himself. And then his friends that were present at the event crafted the Mead of Poetry by mixing his blood with honey after Thor proved once again that he is decidedly not a calm and reasonable person. While the notes on Kvasir's crest and the bits of dialogue that occur when his poems are found do not specifically connect the fabled Mead of Poetry to the blood mead that Kratos collects around the world, given these little lore tidbits in-game and in the Prose Edda that inspired it, I think it's safe to draw the conclusion that they are one and the same. I do think it would be hilarious if Kratos had a 1% chance to start reciting the Iliad after activating Rage, considering he alludes to Mimir that it is his favorite poem. But alas, since the game is now out on PC, I absolutely need someone to make a mod where this happens. Considering that blood mead was really the only truly consumable beverage found in the games, when I saw that there was a God of War Cookbook released in tandem with Ragnarok, I was ecstatic to get my hands on a copy and see what they did with the rage-inducing brew. When it arrived, I ecstatically poured over the contents but was left befuddled. To my dismay, there was no recipe for blood mead to be found. However, There are two drinks in the cookbook that are quasi-tangential to it, and I actually think that by combining them we could get close to the concept of a God of War Blood Mead. We'll actually save that for a future video, but to keep things on track and in lieu of an official recipe,
I'll brew it myself.
to come up with my specific recipe for a blood mead catered to this fictional universe's portrayal, I once again looked to the histories for inspiration as a starting point. There are recipes for Viking blood meads, but despite the name suggesting ancient origins, it turns out it's more of a product of historical romanticism and clever marketing than of documented Viking tradition. It is commonly considered a kind of melomel that uses cherries for that blood red hue, and doesn't really appear until after the time of the Vikings had passed. Vikings, of course, brewed and consumed mead, but there is no direct evidence that they brewed it with cherries specifically and called it blood mead or Viking blood mead. In any event, the cultural touchstone is there, and ever since humans have thought of Vikings as cool, they've brewed this romanticized mead, and were likely inspired by the Prosetta's tale of Kvasir. Groennfell Meadery has two Viking blood-inspired meads in Psychopomp and Heggir, the former being a carbonated sour cherry melomel, and the latter being a sweet cherry melomel. While Danskmjod makes Viking blood, which skips the cherries altogether and opts for a little hibiscus for color and florality and some ginger for spice. We've actually already tasted Heggir and Psychopomp in the third Skyrim and Mead livestream on this channel before I moved the gaming and streaming stuff elsewhere, but it was before any keying was involved or a better camera and microphone setup was configured here at the bar, so instead of subjecting you to its potato quality, I'll do a quick comparison of the three before I move on to the ultimate blood mead of Kratos. First up, Psychopomp. From the can, Psychopomp is a Belgian-style mead brewed with European cherries at high temperatures to create a tart, full-bodied mead. Named after the beings that bring those from the land of the living to the land of the dead, it is extremely popular in both realms. The Valkyries, to the Norse mythology, were essentially their Psychopomp, although the can artwork brings to mind Odin's ravens that you free from his grasp as you travel the 9 realms in God of War, and once again find them at the Raven Tree in Niflheim. They even give you some sweet rewards as a thank you. This is very light and crisp on the nose, just a hint of cherry, smells very tart, and this can is a little bit on the older side of the spectrum, and I believe my last one, I do not think will be shipping these anymore, which is a bummer, but if you find yourself in Vermont, swing by, because I think they still sell their cans in person there. They have said that they are actually moving to only shipping their bottled stuff in the future. Bummer, but it's tasty. It's not super sweet. It is just light, sour, and crisp. Next up, and also from Groennfell, Heggir is derived from the Old Norse word for a cherry orchard, and that's exactly what inspired this cherry mead. European cherries blend with wildflower honey, all aged on cherry wood for a perfectly balanced drink. It smells much sweeter, much richer, not so acidic, and there's a very prominent cherry wood nose. It is round, sweet on the palate, although not as much anymore because this bottle is a little older and perhaps a little bit darker than our friend the Psychopomp. All things considered, I do think I'm more partial to the traditional style anyways, so I'll be able to buy this one in the future sometime still. And lastly, of course, we've got Danskmjod's Viking Blood Mead. When drinking mead, you are drinking 5,000 years of preserved history. Mead is one of the few things that allows us to get in touch with a time when life was lived on nature's terms. Our products are based upon a recipe from about year 1700. The ingredients are pure and 100% natural, guaranteed free from additives. Honey is the major and most important ingredient in the recipe, free from gluten and lactose. To create Viking blood, we have combined the traditional recipe with dried hibiscus and ginger. In addition to the color, this adds a spicy, aromatic, and floral taste. They also suggest to serve slightly chilled as an aperitif, at room temperature as an excellent dessert, or warm as the mulled honey wine. And then they say that they have some other serving suggestions on their website. And right away on the color, it is very much a lighter version compared to either of those. It just looks like regular mead comparatively. I do have somewhere around here another one from them for a future video, but I'm not going to pour it right now. We're keeping this thing on the tracks. There's like almost a minty florality on the nose. Not really getting much specific hibiscus or ginger, but let's see how it tastes. Ginger is definitely much stronger. I'm not really getting a whole lot of hibiscus. It's a super, super mild florality behind all the honey. It is a very syrupy, sweet mead, especially next to these two, and probably next to the one we're about to taste. What I do like about this one in comparison is the ginger aspect. Gives it a little bit of harshness. That's kind of what we're after for a blood mead, or something that's going to make you like when you consume it. The honey and ginger is reminding me of the cordial of Imladris that we made for the Mead of Poetry video. So if you are curious about that eclectic elven cordial, check it out over there. But I heard somewhere that Dansk Mead was somewhat litigious surrounding other breweries using similar names to Viking Blood in their products, but I was unable to verify this. Perhaps it was a bit of a Mandela effect moment, but if you've heard anything about that or have any opinion on these Viking Blood styles, please let me know in the comments. In any event, these are all decent commercial representations of the style in a pinch, but I think we can level this up a bit to make something that better reflects the game's portrayals. To brew a blood mead ourselves, at the moment, the only criteria is that we need to incorporate cherries for a bloody color. To do this, I used a bottle of black cherry juice in the fermentation. However, I want some function with my form. I'd like something with some energizing effects and an additional element that will induce rage. Something that will make you say, upon first sip and really get you going. For the energy, we're in luck. If you were unaware, the coffee plant actually grows cherries. Their seeds are what is traditionally processed and roasted for consumption, but there are a growing number of farms that are exporting the dried cherry husks to be sold and brewed as a tea. There is still some caffeine in the cherry, so that checks the invigorating box for me, while adding a layer of complexity to the cherry melomel profile. Lastly, for that X factor of immediate rage induction, some dried red chili de arbol peppers will lend it some capsaicin to get some burn going on the tongue. So the next time you need a rage-inducing pick-me-up, just tell yourself, it's time to make Kratos' blood mead. Full disclosure, I actually brewed this almost a year ago, hence the stubble, a lack of brewing footage, and not complete cosplay setup. But the good news is, the mead is definitely ready to taste now. I'll leave my details for the recipe in the description, but what you really want to see is how it tastes. So we're going to get into that, and if you want to nerd out about the brewing stuff, we can do that in the comments. Now that looks like a blood mead. Compared to all these other options, you can see how much darker my brew is. It is like deep, rich red. That's how I think it should look for the rage aspect of this and to correspond with Kratos' behavior, as well as being a truly fictional, mythical blood mead. On the nose, we've got some black cherry, but right behind it is this almost leathery, oaky aroma coming from the cascara, or the coffee cherries that we used, which I steeped as a tea before adding it to the mead itself, so that I didn't have to deal with a bunch of husks in there for forever. And then right behind that, you get some red pepper that kind of hits you and lingers on the nose and is a bit of a warning, telling you that it's gonna hit you, it's gonna be spicy. If that worries you, it'll give you some pause. All right, bottoms up. It is really good. I would say that the cascara and the chili de arbol is what takes over the immediate part of the profile, but the black cherry juice lends a lot of body and also carries the palate through the rest of the way, so you get an immediate spice kick, but then you get some chewy, round stone fruit in the middle there, and then it pulls back out into the cascara for that leathery oakiness, and then that finish is just chili burn. It is hot. It's not face-meltingly hot, but it's not invisible. There is spice happening here. stings still, but I think there's room, if you really like spicy stuff, to maybe not double, but add a little bit more. We could have gotten away with like an extra half a pepper, I think, if we really wanted to kick it up. But it's really good, and it really makes me feel like Kratos.
You made it 38 seconds without saying it makes you feel like Spider-Man.
Even if I look a little bit more like Raeb or Tyr right now. Now, as it pertains to yeast in the brewing, this was the last mead I made with Red Star Premier Blanc yeast before graduating to Kvasir for a more accurate Nordic vibe on future projects. I'll probably make this exact recipe again with the Kvasir sometime in the future, but I also think that the stronger alcohol percentage from the Premier Blanc actually lends to the stated booziness of Kvasir's blood, according to Mimir. Anyways, that, my friends, is effectively the closest thing I could conceive of to a blood mead as it appears in the God of War franchise, compared to some commercial representations if you don't want to brew it yourself. You could probably just chuck a couple chili peppers into one of these bottles and get close enough to it, but you wouldn't have the cascara element. While the God of War Cookbook didn't have a recipe for the fabled blood mead, I will still be making a couple videos about it in the next few months, as the featured beverages are nonetheless very cool and extremely well thought out. The Fallout fans in my audience will be pleased to hear that the author of the Vault Dwellers Cookbook, Victoria Rosenthal, also penned the God of War Cookbook alongside Rick Barba, a veritable God of War lore master. It is positioned as Tyr's accrued collection of recipes from his time as Asgard's emissary to the Nine Realms that he transcribed after the events of God of War Ragnarok played out. There are some spoilers surrounding his character, so in the event that you were waiting for the game to come out on PC and have avoided said spoilers thus far, you've got a few weeks before we really dig into his lore and recipes where I will potentially spoil a few important plot points about him. Like I said earlier, there are two recipes that could be combined to get something close to a blood mead concept. If you're new to the channel and have stuck around thus far, I think you'll really appreciate the videos we've got in store and the ones I've released in the last couple years, so please like the video, subscribe for more, and check out some of the other content. My last video on the drink Orkdraut that appears in the Two Towers book and movie was a fun one, but I actually think that what I've brewed for this video may better represent both representations of the beverage. It's simultaneously warming, invigorating, and abrasive, and even looks more like the liquid poured into a semi-conscious Meriadoc Brandy Buck's mouth. If you're inclined to support this channel, thank you. You can be one of my first YouTube members at the link below, or join the Patreon like the noble benefactor IKnewThatWasADog. Check out the Orkdraut video on the left, my gaming stream of the Valhalla DLC on the right, and until next time, cheers.
Anybody need a snack? Kratos? Snack?
I do not need a snack.